Before we get started, I want to encourage you to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications so that you don't miss any of the content that is released by Go Collect. And if you're interested, head over to Reggie Collects here on YouTube. It's Wednesday, and you know what that means. It's time for the Go Collect weekly speculation recap video. Stay tuned. Reggie here, your friendly neighborhood bodybuilder and comic book collector, and the host of the Go Collect weekly speculation recap video. And I want to welcome you to another episode. In this video, we are going to spend some time talking about 5 blog posts that have been submitted into Go Collect. And if you have watched this recap video before, you know that I don't go into all of the detail in each one of these blog posts. But what I attempt to do is to highlight some of the important parts of these posts. But I encourage you in all instances to go over to Go Collect and read these blog posts in their entirety. There are links to those blog posts in the description of this video. One of the things that I want to mention here is that if you are interested in being a writer for Go Collect, you might want to pay attention. They are looking for writers to talk about comics, video games, and concert posters. If you are interested, I want to encourage you to send an email to Andrea@GoCollect.com. In this first blog post from Richard Brown, he makes a declarative statement that there is money to be made in second print comics. And over the course of this blog post, he actually spends a little bit of time kind of explaining the rationale behind second prints and the role that they actually fill. But as I mentioned, he says that there is money to be made. And so a healthy portion of his blog post is actually focused on highlighting several books and why the second prints of some of these books are doing incredibly well. So much so that they are actually worth more in some cases than the first prints of these comics. And one of the books that he highlights is pretty near and dear to my heart. It is Hulk number 377. And this is actually a book that I have owned since 1992. I had this book signed by Dale Keown. I own the first print, but as I mentioned, Richard highlights that the subsequent prints are actually doing incredibly well. And in the case of Hulk number 377, the third print comic at a 9.8 actually goes for a staggering $2,800. It has increased in value 57%. Now, if you compare that to the first print of this comic only goes for about $150 at a 9.8, and that's essentially its FMV. So if you are lucky enough to own the third print or be able to find one, this might be a pretty solid book for you to actually pick up. Richard goes on to talk about an incredibly popular character, that being Miles Morales and his first appearance in Ultimate Fallout number 4. The first print of this particular book at a 9.8 is pretty expensive, but as of late, the second print books have realized a spike. Up until recently, you could actually get a second print, according to Richard, for about $10. But as of late, because of some renewed interest in this second print, the 9.8s are actually up 72% and are being sold for about $130. And so again, if you have an opportunity to pick up one of the second prints of Ultimate Fallout number 4, this might be a book that you want to take a look at. So in addition to a couple of success stories, the blogger goes on to talk about one book that isn't as successful as those others. And he specifically highlights the second print of New Mutants number 87, which is the first appearance of Cable. So again, it seems like there is some money to be made, but there is certainly some pitfalls associated with the second and subsequent prints. But if you're interested in this, you might want to take a look at this blog post, and as a reminder, the link is in the description. Over the last couple of weeks, Matt Tuck has done a fantastic job of highlighting some comics that are doing incredibly well on these indexes found on the Go Collect website. 2 weeks ago, he looked at some modern books that were moving up the list. And last week, he highlighted the books that were on the Silver Age list. And he actually noted in that blog post that a lot of those books that were doing incredibly well, those that were moving up the list, were all Marvel books. And he kind of speculated that that movement had a lot to do with the MCU and also with the Disney streaming services. And he also kind of mentioned in that article that even though these books were moving up the list, they weren't necessarily going for big dollars, and that they also didn't result in a whole lot of sales. The books were just kind of moving up the list. And his speculation was that if people continue to pay attention to these books, that there could be an uptick in values as well. But this week, he actually takes a look at what's happening with the Golden Age Index. Now, the story here is very different in that the vast majority of the books that are doing really well on the Golden Age list are actually DC books, and they are specifically Superman and Batman books. And again, it's the same note here. These books are moving up the list, but it's not necessarily resulting in some increased values, nor is it resulting in a whole lot of sales. So again, just a little bit of cautionary note here. But in this article, he cites several really solid books, and I want to talk very briefly about some of them. The very first book that he highlights, which is currently positioned at 47 on the list, is Superman number 34. And he highlights that earlier this month, a 6.0 of this book actually sold for $516, while a 4.5 brought in $385 in January. This book has actually moved up more than 1,700 spots on the list to again be currently ranked at number 47 on the hottest Golden Age Comics Index. The next book that Matt highlights is Superman number 1. And this book has again moved up 1,700 spots on the list to be sitting at number 13 on the list. And he highlights here that on March 5th, a 3.5 of this book actually sold for $288,000. And that is a staggering amount of money. But it is a really gorgeous cover to this one. The next book that Matt highlights is Batman number 18. And this book too has moved up about 1,700 spots on the list to currently reside at the 38th spot. He highlights Superman number 100, which is currently sitting in 6th place. And he also spends a little bit of time talking about Batman number 17. And there is one additional book that is on this list that Matt talks about. I'm not going to give it away, but I will tell you that the artist is named Frank. If you are curious what that book is and who that artist is, I definitely want to encourage you to click on the link in the description and check out this blog post in its entirety. These next two blog posts that I'm going to talk about are really awesome. And they're awesome because they take me right back to my childhood in that they talk about toys and comics that came out in the 80s when I was a kid.
Thundercats will be back after these messages.
It's its own automatic bridge to climb and conquer anything.
Blood becomes a cross, like a cross, 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 cross.
Cobra Emperor comes with Air Chariot.
Jojo! Look!
The Transformers, more than meets the eye. The Transformers.
There is the chance that there could be some renewed interest in toys and also in cartoons from the 80s. And so you could potentially get ahead of the curve if you pay attention to these two blog posts. In the first blog post, which is entitled "The Toys Are Back, 1980s action figure inspired comics, the blogger takes a look at a couple of really cool comics related to toys. And I'm only going to talk about two of them. And the first two books are really centered on essentially one character or one cast of characters, that being G.I. Joe. In the case of G.I. Joe number 1 and G.I. Joe 21, there could be an uptick in value of these two books because of the Snake Eyes movie that is going to come out at some point in the future. The blogger highlights here that most collectors have been aiming for the graded 9.6 of G.I. Joe number 1. And they highlight that since last year, this same time, 66 copies of G.I. Joe number 1 have actually sold online with an average price close to $150. But they do cite that one copy actually sold in January for a record high of $225. The other book that the blogger focuses on is G.I. Joe number 21, and this is the famous silent issue. It's a really, really fantastic comic. A lot of attention has been paid to the 9.8, which actually recently set a new record of sale at $1,400 in February of this year, which is a staggering amount of money. However, the most popular grade of this particular book happens to be the 9.6, and there have been 25 copies of this comic that have actually sold in the last 12 months for an average price of $373. The blogger goes on to talk about He-Man and also Transformers. So if you're feeling nostalgic or you believe that there's some potential here, you definitely want to take a look at this blog post. So this next blog post, which is entitled Investing in 1980s Cartoon Inspired Comics, actually takes a look at 4 comics. I'm only going to talk about 2 of them because the other 2 characters, I didn't really know what they were, so I'm gonna highlight the 2 that really resonated the most with me. And the first one was Thundercats. Like, who did not watch the Thundercats back in the day? So that was a really cool cartoon. There was a lot of excitement around Thundercats, and I think always has been. And so if you're feeling nostalgic and you think there's some potential here, you definitely want to check out Thundercats number 1. At a 9.8, this is a pretty expensive comic, right? In some respects. Last year, the book averaged $255, but its 90-day average has actually jumped it to $340. In fact, there was a new record high for this book for Thundercats number 1 of $510 in October of last year. The other book that I'll highlight here is Voltron number 1, one of my favorite cartoons back in the day. This book is one that you might want to take a look at, right? This may be a good time to invest in this one. At a 9.8, the 1985 Voltron number 1 has a 90-day average that is just under $100. So again, these might be a couple of books that you want to take a look at. And again, the link to these 2 blog posts that I just spoke about are in the description of this video. This last blog post was really interesting to me. It was interesting because I don't know if I realized just how long of a history that Stephen King has actually had with comics. I knew that he had done some comics, but I don't know that I fully appreciated just how many comics that he had done. And I actually have one of his books in my collection, and I actually did not realize that he had anything to do with it. And so this was a really cool blog post that, again, if you are into horror, if you're a Stephen King fan, these might be some books that you want to take a look at. And let's be honest, if we're all sheltering in place, you might need some reading material. So let me highlight just a couple of these books that the blogger talks about. The very first one is Creepshow, and this is actually Stephen King's first foray into comics, and this book actually dropped in 1982. Now, what's interesting with this book is that he was actually paired with legendary horror artist Bernie Wrightson. And again, I did not know any of that. I never knew that the two of those individuals actually collaborated on a book. And I'm gonna be honest, they actually collaborated on at least 2 books that I know of because of this second one, Heroes for Hope, starring the X-Men. And I actually want to read this excerpt from this blog post in its entirety because this was all new information to me. So I want to read this one to you. Everyone who was anyone in 1980 contributed to this African famine relief fundraiser issue. In one comic, you have all of the giants of the industry, most notably Stan Lee, John Romita Jr., Frank Miller, Alan Moore, Chris Claremont, John Byrne, Art Adams, John Buscema, and Bernie Wrightson, just to name a few. Even the Game of Thrones author George Martin was part of this issue. He goes on to highlight here that Stephen King and Bernie Wrightson actually collaborated to create Famine, who is basically death and starvation personified. I did not know that. I'm gonna be completely honest. That issue is literally sitting right there in front of me. I have never read it, and it's been in my collection for well over a year. And honestly, I am now motivated to take a look at that comic because I think it's even cooler than I thought it was before. So there you have it. That is essentially the wrap up of this week's Go Collect Speculation Recap video. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I definitely want to encourage you to tune in next week when we do this all over again. If you've enjoyed this video, I want to encourage you to hit the thumbs up button, leave a comment behind so we can mix it up in the comment section. Take care.